And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And I couldn't believe that actually it's been a year since Billboard Chris was with us. I did catch up with him on War Room more recently. But Billboard Chris, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thanks so much for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me. I can't believe it's been a year.
I
Time is
know.
flying.
Time flies. A lot has happened. And one of the recent posts I saw off you down under, I think, and obviously people can find you at Billboard Chris, just in case you didn't get and are not following him on X, was your arrest down under in Australia, and you visited many different countries, different responses, some many very positive, many very peculiar responses, and some legal pushback and maybe political pushback. But maybe mention what's happened to you down under, because you're involved also in a legal case there.
Yeah, so I went to Australia about a year ago, and just before I took that trip, just to do my thing, having conversations on the street about why children shouldn't be getting puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgeries and all that. Just before that trip, I had received notice from X that they'd been ordered to take down one of my posts. So in Australia, they have this government bureaucrat named Julie Inman Grant. She's an American woman living there, and her job is to censor the internet for Australians. She decides what they can say and see on the internet, and she decided that they shouldn't see this post of mine where I criticized a woman named Teddy Cook, a woman now pretending to be a man, a woman who posts bondage, bestiality pictures, says trans identified people have better sex when they're high on illicit drugs, wants government funded sex changes, including for children. Naturally, this woman was appointed to the World Health Organization to draft their healthcare policy for all individuals identifying as trans, including children. So I called her a woman because she is, and I criticized her. And they ordered my post taken down. So X refused. I filed an appeal with their administrative review tribunal. So did X. So I went back there just a few weeks ago for this 5-day hearing about my single post. I think it was 35 words. So we had to spend 5 days talking about it. And my very first day in Australia, I got there a bit early, almost a week early. I went into Brisbane. I was meeting with different politicians and stuff in 4 different cities. But I had some spare time, so I went into Brisbane. I found a busy part of the city where a lot of people were walking around. And I set myself up in the corner of a town square. And within 45 minutes, I was being given an $806 ticket for refusing to leave. I was told by this council worker that I was obstructing people, which is patently untrue. I specifically set up my tripod out of the way by a big pole where no one's going to run into it or try to smash it, which happens from time to time.
I
And
mean,
I just stand there quietly and I wait for people to come up to me.
either your billboard was very large or the Australian pavements are very small. Well, I don't know which one it was.
Yeah, this town square was probably about 40 by 40 yards. So it's big. Lots of room for people to walk around me. And people were coming up to talk like they always do. And then I was told I had to leave. And I refused to leave because I wasn't obstructing anyone and the council worker was lying. So then it ended up, we had 9 police come and they told me to leave and I refused to leave based on a lie. I'm there defending freedom of speech. That's why I'm in the country. And now I'm in the, they've already censored me on the digital town square. My post has been geo-blocked in Australia. Now they're trying to censor me in the physical town square, where I'm talking about what? I'm talking about the greatest child abuse scandal in the history of modern medicine. I'm not some bad guy. I'm part of the good team, trying to protect kids from permanent harm. They let all these pro-Hamas protesters lay down in the street and shut down the entire mall. And they told me during this whole hour-long saga that went on with the police that I was the first person they'd ever done this to. Out of all the people that have ever been in that mall area, it's a public street, it's outside. I was the only person they'd ever moved on. So anyway, I refused to move, and they took off my signs. A police officer grabbed my left arm, another one grabbed my right arm, and they physically marched me out of there. And I thought I was getting arrested and taken to jail, but they just let me go. I don't think they want the international incident. And I think they also know that the council worker was probably full of it, but they felt like they had to do his bidding for some reason because he called them to get rid of me.
So fill us in on the that legal action there, because this is I mean, Australia actually don't have the censorship laws. I don't think that Europe having the Digital Services Act, the UK having the Online Safety Bill. Australia, I think I remember back in August, and they pulled back on legislation they were looking at to actually police the internet. So it seems Australia is in a better place, but you seem to have fallen foul of laws there.
I don't think they're in much of a better place. There are definitely more arrests going on in England. I see that. How many arrests were there last year? They were doing more than 30 a day. It was something like
30 a day.
12,000 arrests based on
Yep.
people's social media posts. But no, they have this e-safety commissioner who originally, when they drafted this legislation, the E-Safety Act, it was about protecting children from online harm, from child sexual exploitation and things like that, things that everyone can get behind. But that, of course, was a Trojan horse, and the powers of this e-safety commissioner have expanded, whereby they unilaterally decide what Australians can see, what they can say. You'll remember the stabbing of the Bishop Mar Mari Emmanuel,
Yep.
the Islamic guy walking down the aisle of church, and he stabbed him. I think he lost his eye, and he was shouting Allahu Akbar as he did it. You couldn't see anything gory at all in that video, but the e-safety commissioner succeeded in getting it taken down off the entire internet. Why? Would this have happened if the roles were reversed, if it was a Christian attacking a Muslim? I doubt it very much, because this government is ideologically driven. But they actually, X sued them on that as well, and they actually won. So that video was restored. And then with my tweet, it's the same sort of thing. There are women in Australia who've also been censored for saying things like men shouldn't be chest feeding babies. So the censorship always goes one way. This is a trans activist working for the government, and they have a $42.5 million budget now to censor the internet for Australians. So it's different than what's going on in the UK, but it's still very censorious. And everywhere I went in Australia, they were trying to get rid of me. Police were always getting called. Security was always telling me to leave. And I kept saying, I'd like to see the law. Let me see this evidence. And they can never produce it. So you still do have the right to have conversations in Australia, but they're trying to censor us everywhere, including on the digital and physical town squares.
Tell me, we'll maybe venture back into Europe and down under, but tell me about Canada. In obviously in the US, and we'll get onto that with President Trump winning the election. And we're in a different situation there, and it'd be good to get your thoughts on that. But in Canada, you've got an upcoming election, and there's an opportunity to push back on on kind of the full on socialism that really has been there under Trudeau. Give us your thoughts on what's happening, because that's only weeks away.
Yeah, it's on April 28th. I'm actually going to be in Ottawa. I'm holding a rally, probably a walk through Mark Carney's district. So Mark Carney is the new Liberal leader. When Trudeau stepped down, the Conservatives had something like a 25-point lead, basically an insurmountable lead over the Liberals. They were looking good for a majority government. Now they're behind. It's one of the greatest collapses ever. We'll see how it plays out at the actual election, the only poll that matters. But Mark Carney is former Bank of Canada governor, Bank of England governor. He runs Brookfield, or did run Brookfield Asset Management. And he's one of these guys who, in a speech recently, said, yes, he's a globalist and an elitist, and that's the type of person that Canada needs right now. He's one of these climate hysterics. And anyway, it's not looking good right now. It looks like he's going to win. And just the last day or two, he's been talking about bringing back again for the third time. They're going to try to bring in hate speech legislation in Canada. So, to be honest, there's not a whole lot separating the liberals from the conservatives in this country. It's probably similar to what you have and similar to Labor and liberals down under. But with Pierre, at least, they're not going to introduce hate speech legislation. He will be better on some issues. I mean, he's basically just a liberal himself, but it's not looking good. So we'll see how it plays out. But I think Carney has to be better than Trudeau. I would hope so. It's hard to get much worse or much more leftist than Trudeau, but I don't think there's a whole lot of difference going on. And it's the same thing we've seen all over the world. There's this push for censorship. So hopefully, with Trump and Vance in power, they can use whatever leverage they have to prevent these hate speech bills from becoming law. Because, yes, I talk a lot about gender ideology and the harms coming there. But a big part of my campaign is also freedom of speech. So that's my big concern with the Liberals.
I mean, the big watching Pierre Pulver, and it seemed to be that he was the answer, and yet I've talked to a number of conservatives in Canada, and they're saying no, 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 no,
No,
no.
no.
He knows how to maybe use the media, but actually he is not someone who is very different. But yeah, but that something hasn't gotten through, and I guess the fear was that Mark Carney would step in. I think Mark Carney's one of his children went through the Tavistock clinic, and that kind of shows you exactly where he is as an individual.
Yeah, and he was saying just this past week that he wants to make sure everyone has full access to puberty blockers and all that. So he's got all these ties to England, where Wes Streeting, Minister of Health under a Labour government, they've put a permanent ban in place on puberty blockers. His own daughter went to the Tavistock. She wasn't medicalized, thankfully. As an adult, she's a bit of an activist, writing essays about this. But not even the conservatives want to talk about that at all. But for me, this is a political issue. When you raise a child and you send your own child to a gender clinic, and your adult child now doesn't even know that she's a woman, and she is politically involved herself in talking about this, I think it is a conversation point, but none of them want to talk about it. But no, Pierre Poilievre has never been a conservative, ever. I don't know where everyone got this idea. Maybe it was the Apple video. That's a good 30-second clip where he embarrassed a really terrible reporter, but that's not hard to do. Poilievre voted for Bill C-6 back in 2021. That bill died before we had our election back then, before it passed the Senate. But Bill C-6 and then Bill C-4, which was passed unanimously, made it a crime for anyone, including parents, to help their child feel comfortable with their sex. If your girl thinks she's a boy, that's okay. If you convince her she's a boy, that's okay. But if you object to this, you object to physically harming your child, you object to their transition with puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries, and you work to help them feel comfortable with their sex, that's now a crime of conversion therapy. With C6, Poilievre voted for that bill, even when the majority of conservatives did not. With C4, the conservatives actually fast-tracked it through. They didn't even hold a formal vote. It was just an oral declaration. Anyone against? No? Okay, it passed. And then they were all literally cheering and hugging each other across the aisle in Parliament. What really happens with this bill, it puts a chill on the whole psychotherapeutic profession. No one will even talk to these kids anymore in talk therapy because they're worried that activists will come along and say they're committing conversion therapy. He's never said he's going to repeal this bill. He doesn't campaign on anything to do with gender ideology. He just gave a speech earlier this week where he said they're not going to do a thing about abortion. And I get this is a hot topic, but Canada is one of the only places in the world where at any time during a pregnancy, the woman can abort her child, including in the 9th month. And they don't want to do anything about that. The private members bill was presented a few years ago by a conservative to ban sex-selective abortion. So this is where, primarily Chinese and Indian communities will abort their child because she's female. That's what's going on. And Pierre Poilievre voted against that private member's bill. On all the socially conservative issues, he votes the wrong way. So he's a career politician. He's been in Ottawa for 20 years. He learned a long time ago to keep his mouth shut about the more sensitive cultural issues. And that's who he is. He said there's nothing he can do federally about the harm coming to kids, which is a lie. There's a federal bill, Bill C-16, which made it a crime to discriminate against men in women's sports or women's prisons or women's spaces or women's rape shelters. And they don't campaign on any of this stuff, even though it's a huge winning issue.
It seems that the Conservative Party have never passed Stephen Harper. They've never managed to find their feet again. And Maxime Bernier, wonderful, but hasn't galvanized the political, the electoral support needed to actually win anything. And therefore, Canada are left with this kind of confusion of the Conservative Party trying to find out who they are, not really knowing, and coming up with all different leaders. And without a strong leader to stand for something, it seems though they'll continue failing at the elections.
They will. There needs to be a massive change. This country is in a lot of trouble. We don't elect our Senate. They're appointed. And 70% of them have been appointed by Liberals, and they have lifetime appointments. You can't get rid of them until they're 70 years old. So we need all of their approval on every bill that passes, but you can't get rid of them. The judiciary, it's the same thing. They're very leftist. They're politically captured. Any bill that's passed to actually stop any of this gender madness, a judge will come along and try to stop it. We do have something called the notwithstanding clause written into our constitution, which basically allows a premier or prime minister to overrule these judges for 5 years. So they can invoke that if they need to. It's not done very often. But no, Pierre's, what did he campaign on? He's been the leader for, I guess, a little over 2 years now of the Conservative Party. And what did he campaign on for 2 years? Axe the tax. Axe the carbon tax. That's all he talked about. None of the bigger cultural issues, nothing about immigration. He still wants to do mass immigration. He wants to reduce it to 250,000 people per year. They won't hit those numbers, of course. So they're still going to be having mass immigration going on. And all he wanted to talk about was the carbon tax, which, sure, that's an issue, even though consumers get a rebate and it really didn't cost them much at the end of the day. Yes, let's get rid of the carbon tax. But that's maybe number 7 or 8 or 9 down on the list. But it's all he talked about. He was trying to play it safe, banking on the unpopularity of Trudeau. And what happened? Trudeau resigned. They brought in a new guy. Instantly, that huge lead he had vanished. Trump's rhetoric didn't help, talking about the 51st state and all that. But then he was given an opportunity with the tariffs as well, where he could have blamed it on Trudeau. And he could have said, under my government, we're going to work out a trade deal that everyone's happy with, and we'll get rid of these tariffs. Instead, he went on the attack against Trump, just like Trudeau, just like Carney. He doesn't differentiate himself on anything. So I'm really trying not to be partisan here. I just tell the truth. But this Conservative Party is continually disappointing. I was in Australia for 2 weeks. I met with 20 different members of parliament and senators. In Canada, not one in 4.5 years, provincially or federally, has met with me because they won't discuss these issues. We had a protest of 30 to 40,000 people across Canada a couple years. Pierre told all his MPs they weren't allowed to talk about it because it's the gender issue. It's just weakness. And until they stop trying to be liberal light, they're not going to win.
One question before we go south of the border of the US. You kind of look at, you are an individual now with a high profile worldwide, and you've got that because you speak truth on this issue in a vacuum where many have been afraid to speak, and you travel the world and use the power of media. I know Ezra Levant has also spoken a lot about this issue, but the other individual that is a towering figure in terms of speaking on this is Jordan Peterson, and I think his article going back like 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago in the Daily Telegraph said that we're sacrificing our children on the altar of a brutal far left ideology, talking about the trans ideology. Um, you, Ezra, Jordan, all Canadians, with high profile. How how is that message getting out to the public in Canada? Probably in a way that the legacy media do not want to talk about this. You're three individuals that actually use the power of alternative media to get the message out. Tell us how that is or can have an impact on Canadians.
Well, this is a huge winning issue politically. It always has been. All you have to do is give the message our children are perfect just as they are. No drugs or scalpels needed. You have 90% support right there. Even if it's 80. The sports issue, huge winning issue. Always has been. I know this better than anyone because I'm out on the street in all these different cities all around the world. And unless I go to a university campus where you get this show of activists who show up and take up all my time for 3 hours, and it maybe looks like there's more opposition than there is, out there in the real world, all the adults understand this is madness. We shouldn't be doing childhood sex changes. They virtually all get it. All the men get it. The only pushback I get from men comes from the gay community sometimes. They're really split. I think a lot of them think about their own life growing up, how they were bullied because they were different. And now they see these kids, and maybe these kids are different. And they just project onto them what they went through. And their attitude is leave them alone. But they don't even realize a lot of these kids would grow up to be gay, like them. If a lot of these gay men were growing up today, they'd come to believe that they were trans because they're more effeminate. But no, there's huge support all over the world. And any politician who messages on this wins. And we saw this in the US election. What was the biggest issue affecting swing voters? According to exit polling, it wasn't immigration. It wasn't the economy. It was trans. The number one issue affecting independent voters that caused them to vote Republican was transgender madness. And Trump didn't want to speak about this a little over 2 years ago either. The first time he spoke about this was in March of 2023 at CPAC. I was sitting there in sixth row. And it was the first speech he gave where he talked about this. And he said he was going to get rid of stop the chemical castration of children and get men out of women's sports. And the biggest applause he got in this 90-minute speech was for that. And he noted in other speeches he gave, he'd be giving a speech to farmers. And the biggest applause he got was when he said he would stop this madness. And this does another thing. When you speak about this, it speaks to your integrity, how you're willing to tackle some of the more controversial issues and just tell the truth about them. And that sends a message to voters about who you are as a person beyond this issue. But you speak about Jordan Peterson, and yes, he's been great on this. But notice in the podcast he just had, a couple hours long with Pierre Poilievre last month, did they talk about gender even once? No. Why? Because it's a condition of Pierre giving the interview that Jordan doesn't bring it up. The one thing that we know Jordan Peterson for is gender. That's what made him famous. And he doesn't even bring it up because Pierre won't talk about it.
Wow. That is telling. I haven't watched interview. That is telling. You mentioned that CPAC. I was also there. I was in the front left transept, and also I vividly remember that, Chris, that huge round of applause whenever he said, "We're going to keep men out of women's bathrooms," and then give another line and a huge cheer. And it was a small, very small part of the speech, but got a huge response. And that has been Trump has seen that his team saw that they saw this was an important issue, a vote winning issue, and you kind of never know whether someone is ideologically aligned or whether they just see it as a vote winning issue. I hope and pray it's both with President Trump. But tell us about, since he's been in office, all those executive orders. Now, we haven't spoken since that happened. How do you see that happening? There's so many areas that this needs tackled on. And President Trump is not afraid or not shy of engaging with each of those battlefronts that need to be pushed back on. So how have you seen his work on engaging on this issue? And I guess trying to get justice and trying to stop children going down this avenue.
Yeah, I think the first month of his presidency was the best month I've ever seen. for any president or any politician, period. All of his executive orders were pretty much perfect. He did everything he could to stop this from the executive branch. So there will be no more funding given to any hospital that's doing childhood sex changes. No more funding from Medicaid going towards this. And they've brought in people. They've just brought in a new lawyer into the Justice Department to specifically go after some of these bad actors. That hasn't been announced yet, but that will be big news. They brought in Harmeet Dillon, one of the lawyers who's suing for these detransitioners. She's now leading the Office of Civil Rights. So they're making a lot of good moves, bringing great people into the administration. He banned all federal funding for any school that is allowing boys or males to compete in female sports. I was there for the signing of that executive order in the White House. That was a great day. And yeah, on these cultural issues, I think he's absolutely killing it. So what did he do? He just told the truth. And they ended up spending $150 million advertising on this one issue heading into the election, which helped them win the election. And people in the United States aren't different than people in Canada or the UK or Australia or wherever. We all know our children are beautiful just as they are. And we all know that it's totally insane to have men competing in women's sports. So I don't know why all these politicians are hesitant to talk about it, because it's a big winning issue for them. And forget about that. You have a moral obligation to speak about what is the greatest child abuse scandal in our lifetime. They virtue signal about the harm done to Indigenous children at residential schools. And yes, there were a lot of bad things about residential schools. There's currently still a hoax going on in Canada about hundreds of children's bodies being found by ground-penetrating radar. Not a single body has ever been found. It was a big hoax. But they flew the flag at half-mast at Parliament for 6 months in Canada because of a hoax. The New York Times and the Washington Post reported mass graves were found with children's remains as young as 3 years old. Not a single bone was found. Nothing. All it was anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar. It could be anything. But they flew the flag at half-mast for 6 months. They set aside billions of dollars for reconciliation. What's going on today is far worse than anything that happened at those residential schools. Indigenous kids in state care today are being sterilized. One doctor in British Columbia, where I'm from, named Wallace Wong, says he's transitioning more than 1,000 kids, including 500 in state care. There are only 6,000 kids in state care in BC. 500 are being transitioned. And when you look at the statistics, 52% of kids in state care are Indigenous. So if they want something to get upset about and virtue signal over, there's something happening in present time that they're all mum about. And they could help to win the election on it. But what do? They're afraid of the media. They're afraid of what the left is going to say. There's no excuse to be afraid of media in 2025. We're the media. Peter, you're the media. There's social media. Pierre could be making 5-minute videos every day explaining these topics. And then all the mainstream media would also run with those videos and talk about it more. And he could educate the population about it and move the Overton window himself. But they don't do any of that. He doesn't do the podcasts. If you look at Trump, one of the reasons Trump won is because he did all these podcasts with young people. He reached the young men especially. Pierre does none of this. He won't give interviews. It's really just Jordan Peterson, a couple others. But he won't do any of this. He's relying on the old school tactics of winning an election, and it's losing him the election. So I don't know what it's going to take for these guys to learn. I think half the party needs to split off and form a new party.
Yeah, well, we'll see if that happens. It's interesting the difference between Javier Milei and Argentina going up there and spending time with President Trump. And of course, that's more focused on the economic side and not the cultural side. But Pierre could maybe learn that. Maybe the tariff talk he feels has been a barrier. But there are so many. I remember having a conversation with my older child and discussing whether actually President Trump should go after all those doctors that have carried this out. And he was saying, they were doing maybe what they were told was best within that. And I was saying, well, no one can really morally accept that actually doing that to a child, doing that to another human being is right. And therefore, Trump should go after all of those doctors. And the line is, which we've heard in times before, is they're just following orders. But there has to be a stand by doctors to say, actually, this is not right. I know that doctors who are pro-life will say, actually, there's no way I can perform an abortion because I believe life is life. And it has to be the same for doctors carrying out these transition surgery. But how will that work out with, you talk about the funding being cut off, but the legal action of going after those doctors who have horrendously butchered children, that also has to be part of this.
Well, it's not been a crime, and there aren't laws against it. So, first of all, they're not following orders. This is done by a handful of doctors. All the harm done to thousands of kids is done by a relatively very small number of doctors. At the gender clinic at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, it's Johanna Olsen Kennedy running that clinic. She herself is harming thousands of kids. It's not all these other doctors everywhere. It's her. It's other ideological doctors like her. And she was given $10 million by the NIH to study this. And she didn't like the results of her study, so she buried it. It's still not been released. Hopefully, RFK gets that released. I just received a message earlier this week, actually, a member of his team I was working with a year or two ago, helping her get up to speed on puberty blockers. She's the one that got him to come on board because of all that. But now they're going to be conducting a study of their own into transition regret and detransitioners. So that's good. They're starting to come around. But no, they need to pass legislation federally. Congress needs to pass legislation criminalizing childhood sex changes. Then they can go after these doctors. Right now, they can just go after them civilly, and they can hurt them in their pocketbooks. And of course, it's going to be the insurance companies who pay these settlements. There's a law firm called Campbell Miller Payne. They have 13 lawsuits going on right now. They're looking at another 150 cases. And in almost all these cases, the children have autism, by the way. Virtually everyone. But when they start winning settlements, it's the insurance companies paying out those settlements, and then the insurance companies will probably put a stop to this themselves. But yes, Congress needs to pass law to criminalize this, and all these countries do.
And you said autism, and I interview just done with Robert Malone and talking about the measles outbreak and then autism. And Bobby Kennedy has said that by September, or even earlier, that we will know what is behind that huge rise. And autism seems to be a condition that has been used by this industry. Um, why is that? Is that children who are susceptible? Is that children who are maybe can be pushed in a direction that maybe others could not? Why is the focus been on autistic children?
It's a great question. I think, and we don't really have all the answers, but certainly they're more socially awkward. And so when kids aren't fitting in, and then some ideology comes along and says, hey, this is the reason you're not fitting in. You were born in the wrong body. And then as soon as they declare that they're trans, well, now they're getting love bombed, like in a cult, really. And they have this whole new community and all this love and affection. Well, that feels good. Or they post online, I'm trans. This girl says she's a boy, and they get 1,000 likes. Well, they get this idea locked into their head, and it can be just more difficult with behavioral issues. And it can be tougher for their parents to reach them once this idea is already stuck in their head. And you have, as part and parcel of this whole ideology, you have this effort by activists to drive wedges between children and their parents. And so oftentimes by the time parents learn about this, that indoctrination has already driven that wedge into place. And they already think their parents are old school, they're dinosaurs, they don't understand. And in certain jurisdictions, parents don't have rights to protect their own kid. They worry they'll get their kid taken away. And then in a lot of cases, you have parents pushing this on their children as well, especially the moms. Virtually every custody dispute going on, it's the mom trying to push this, it's the dad trying to stop it. And we know how custody disputes work across the world, it usually goes in favor of the mother. There was a great case down in Australia just recently where the mother was stripped of custody because she wanted to give puberty blockers to her child, and the judge issued an excellent ruling. Very common sense, great judge. So that child was just a week ago saved from this madness. But yeah, it's just one of those things. You have partnerships with autistic centers and children's hospitals where they're almost like a pipeline into the gender clinic. If you go to the Seattle Children's Hospital or Chicago Children's Hospital website and you go to the page about gender, you'll see it right on there where they talk about their partnerships with these autistic communities. And it's not just kids with autism, of course. It's kids who would grow up to be gay. It's kids who've suffered abuse and trauma and sexual abuse. And according to the CAS report, parents were 10 times as likely to be sex offenders. So it's just all the struggling kids. And the ones who need help are the ones who are being harmed.
Wow. Tell us, we've talked to Jeff Younger, got to know Jeff a little bit, and his case of his former ex-wife taking the child to California, and that issue of state by state. And that's something I think we're going to have to see how that plays out whenever conservative states are not sanctuary states to protect children from this. There's a huge problem. But where do you see your activism going forward? Because when you started out, politically, it was a very difficult situation in the US, very difficult in Canada, and probably across Europe. And we're now seeing bright sparks of common sense parties and common sense governments across Europe, that we maybe wouldn't have seen even 2 years ago. And of course, with the US leading the world and saying this is how it's going to happen. And a lot of those populist parties, whether it's in Hungary or Italy, or newer parties springing up in Germany or Austria, pushing back against this woke ideology. And part of that is how we treat our children, how we sexualize our children, and the whole trans movement. How do you see your work fitting into that? Because we all want a goal to what we are doing. We all want an end result. And the end result you want is for children to be free of this ideology and to not live in any fear that they would be pushed down this avenue. But how do you see your work fitting into, I guess, the current political climate?
I, I just wake up every day and try to do something decent, try to educate some people. So the videos I make on the street are helpful because they reach a lot of people now, especially now that I've recently started posting on YouTube and Facebook. I tried to ignore Facebook forever, but I realize it's very valuable. That's where a lot of the moms still are, and it's getting huge traction right away. And YouTube's very successful too. But this is just a matter of educating people, and when you educate enough people, some of them become active in fighting this. So I know all over the world, people have become active fighting this because of my work. They become active fighting it because of other people's work. When you put work into this, you're going to generate ripples, and you never know where those ripples are going to lead. I was just in Australia, and I met with all these different politicians. I am following up with them to give them talking points and all the basic resources they need and help to educate them to speak about this where they're comfortable doing so. Because a lot of times when people don't know how to talk about it, they just won't talk about it. But it's not really that difficult. And it's important to emphasize the positives and the things that people agree with. The positives, of course, being that our children are perfect just as they are. No one can disagree with this message. They don't need drugs or scalpels and pharmaceutical products to be their true selves. And parents understand this. Adults understand this, who haven't been indoctrinated by university for the last 4 years of gender studies. But yeah, I'm working with different politicians all around the world, and who knows where that leads. I went to Davos to the World Economic Forum. I stood on the street. Someone took a picture of my sign. They featured it on the main stage on the big screen during their LGBTQ panel, and they talked about the pushback for 3 minutes. So they did me a huge favor, but that's just goes to show what happens when you just go outside and people start talking about it. And when I go to a university campus, I might get mobbed by 10 activists or whatever, or 100. Depends. I'm going to Ottawa soon. It's going to be a big scene over there. But what I don't see and what I'm not a part of are the other 1,000 conversations that get started at that university campus. between people who then look it up and who might talk to their parents about it or whatever. So we have the truth on our side. We just have to keep having these conversations and spreading awareness, because eventually that truth keeps spreading and we put a stop to it, just like we have other inhumane things that were done by the medical profession, like lobotomies, for example.
No, I agree, and I think your videos do provide fascinating conversations. They get shared, they get passed on. They become conversations in families, in school WhatsApp groups, and all over. And I think the important thing, certainly in the political side, I learned this in kind of my time working behind the scenes in politics, is that politicians have a lot happening. And if someone can come and provide them with an understanding of what this is in a simple way they can grasp, then they can feel equipped to actually push that forward. And they know how to answer the questions from the legacy media that will tell them they're haters for standing up. So I think what you do connecting with politicians is essential, and it gives them the tools that they can use to then stand up and speak truth in their countries.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're all dealing with 100 things. So there are only three objections you ever hear. You'll hear that children will kill themselves if we don't transition them, that puberty blockers are reversible, and they try to deflect by talking about intersex people. All of these are easily handled, but they just need to know the basics. So I work on that, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, we're making progress all over the world. Even in Canada, in Alberta, they've stopped this for kids under 16 years of age. So that's a start. It's going to take a while, but we'll just keep going and we'll get there.
Chris, what's the best way people following you, supporting you? Obviously, that's the handle on Twitter. You mentioned moving on to Facebook, YouTube. I don't know whether, I guess if Facebook and Instagram would cope with these videos, I don't know whether TikTok can cope with them. But yeah, how can people find and how do they support what you do to make sure you can keep traveling around the world and asking these questions?
Yeah, I'm on all those platforms. So Instagram and YouTube are the best place to find my videos. And I don't run into trouble on those platforms, actually, even with other people's interviews through the years. My stuff never gets taken down. So I'm not too worried about it. But yeah, people can support me through my website, billboardchris.com. And the best place to follow me, I guess, would be X and YouTube, probably. But really, I just want people to get educated about this and have these conversations, because that's how we're going to put a stop to this. We can't just rely on one or two or three or 10 or 20 people around the world to spread awareness about this. It has to be us in our own communities doing it.
Which is why I always love having you on to take this and spread it a little bit further, a little bit wider, and put it on people's radar. Chris, thank you so much for giving us your time for the War Room Posse watching. I remember having you on whenever I had the previous guest hosting War Room, so it's good to have you back on, and for the War Room Posse to talk, listen to you in a little bit more depth and find out what you're doing. So thanks so much for giving us your time in the midst of all the activism that you're doing all over the world.
Thanks, Peter. And I'll see you in September. I'm coming to London.